You have all these losers, the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, who used to run Socialist International, a collection of socialist, communist, mass murdering Marxist political parties, the largest in the world.
Sounds like
And
lovely people.
said, hey, we're gonna rebuild the economies and the societies that we just burned down, but we're gonna do it on a more sustainable basis. It's gonna be more climate friendly. They actually got a lot of their goals passed, but they keep saying that there's parallels between the fight against coronavirus and the fight against global warming, and they're right, but not in the way that they want you to think. Right? One of the most obvious ways that they're right is the models, right? Their stupid climate models told us that we were supposed to see runaway warming, that glaciers were going to be melting, we were all going to be dying from heat. And even with their manipulated data, it shows that we haven't had any really global warming for 25 years now. Okay, so it was a fraud. Their models were completely wrong. The UN relied on 73 supercomputer models. Every single one predicted drastically more warming than we've had. Literally, a monkey in a cage with some dice would have better odds of predicting future temperatures than the UN's models. And if you think that's a coincidence, if you think they're just a bunch of morons running these things, I've got a nice bridge and some nice beachfront property in Nebraska. We'll talk later. But the coronavirus models were exactly the same, David. This Imperial College in London, this lunatic doctor who just got caught sneaking out during the lockdown to go have sex with one of his paramours.
Wow.
When everybody else was supposed to be locked down, right? He had to resign his post. But he came from Imperial College London, and they're the ones who came, of course, it's funded by Bill Gates, naturally, and they're the ones who came out with these models that said 2 million people in the UK were going to die. And then like, okay, yeah, that was when they shut everything down. 2 million people are going to die. They said, okay, actually, it's only going to be like 50,000. Okay, that's a pretty big difference. And they said, no, actually, we were wrong again. It's only going to be like 5,000. And actually, 3,500 of those probably would have died from something else anyways this year. And so we've shut down the entire economy of the United Kingdom to supposedly stop 1,000 something deaths. And now the the governor of New York tells us that the people who are getting coronavirus are the people locked at home. So their models are completely fraudulent. They were designed not to tell us what would happen, but to spark fear and terror in the hearts of gullible people who still watch CNN and NBC and CBC and other fake news channels. And they worked for a time, but now the chickens are coming home to roost. They're all being exposed as frauds, as quacks. They burned down our economy for nothing, and we cannot let them get away with rebuilding what they destroyed in their own image.
Now, Alex, some people may have trouble with this where they're trying to figure out why. Why would they do this? Is it just that they're, like you said, are they just stupid? Do they not know? Why do they keep making the same mistakes? Why do we keep seeing the same trends? Are these people just grossly incompetent? Or is there something more going on here?
Yeah, and it really boils down to those two options. Are they stupid and incompetent, or is there something else going on? Are they evil, power-hungry, money-grubbing freaks? And when you look at these two options and you look at the evidence, there should be no question at all. These are not stupid people. In fact, we do have to give them credit where credit is due. They are incredibly smart, right? They managed to manipulate a significant portion of humanity, of 7 billion people, into believing that we were all going to die from global warming, that we were all going to die from coronavirus. And conveniently, the solution to every problem they manufacture is always give up all your money, give up all your freedom, and let us control your life. Always. No matter what the problem, that's always the solution. So I think it's very clear, David, we're not dealing with stupid people. We're not dealing with incompetent people. In fact, we're dealing with geniuses, diabolical geniuses. Their agenda, quite simply, is to enslave us. I mean, it's just the only way to put it. You want to sound respectable, so they just want to take away our. No, they want to enslave us, and we need to be honest. They want to create a totalitarian global technocracy with them in charge, and those of us who survive. I mean, if you notice, if you listen to these people, they will tell you to your face, there's way too many people on the planet. We think there should be less of you. Henry Kissinger, when he was National Security Advisor, put together the National Security Memorandum 200. You can go read it online today. Way too many people in the world. We need to depopulate the third world. Bill Gates will tell you over and over again, there's way too many people in the world. We're going to reduce the population using vaccines and abortions. You can go watch the videos yourself. I just put out a big video about Bill Gates on my show, Behind the Deep State, which you can find on YouTube for now, at least. So these people are not stupid. They're very smart, and they're very, very evil.
And again, we've gone through this in other shows, but the idea is to look at history. So for those of people who are still not convinced, you have to look at the track record of history, and you have to have something called pattern recognition. And it's something that human beings have been given as a gift. It comes with the package. So you should turn it on and use it. And what that is what every good journalist has is the ability to recognize patterns. And not that you're trying to create patterns where there aren't any. You don't have to do that with this. This is something where if you keep following the money, that's always a great place to find a bunch of coincidences, right? B, you follow the track record of all the people and the careers of all the people and how they go back and forth between media, big pharmaceutical companies, the military industrial complex, government positions, big councils, and all these. And you just see that swing door policy that happens. As you were saying in the previous episode that got us censored by CBC, is that the history of the United Nations, which was founded by the Rockefeller family and many other interesting characters, has not this glowing history that everybody wants it to have. And so maybe we could just say a little bit, just to recap for people that didn't see our previous interview, about the United Nations and how that eventually grew, and the World Health Organization, and sort of the history of how that all came to be.
Yeah, so very simply, I mean, they tried after World War I to set up the nucleus of a world government. They called it the League of Nations. And our U.S. Senate very wisely said, no, absolutely, positively not. We're going to keep our sovereignty and we're going to keep our self-government. Thank you. So they came back after World War II, after they had destroyed much of the planet and killed millions of people. And they said, hey, let's try this again. We'll create the United Nations. Now, there should be no doubt that this was actually established to create the nucleus for a future totalitarian world government. How do we know? Well, on one side of the table, you had Joseph Stalin, one of the worst mass murderers in human history, one of the victors of World War II, thanks to massive amounts of American assistance. We built him factories. We sent him warplanes. We built him factories to build warplanes and tanks, right? So on one side, you had Joseph Stalin, and then the United States, the other superpower, came with a guy called Alger Hiss. Now, he had been running the Carnegie Foundation, one of the big international foundations that worked very closely with the Rockefeller Foundation on hijacking education. Well, Alger Hiss went from these foundations over to the State Department, and from there, he became the first Secretary General of the United Nations, and he became the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter. And then a few years later, we put him in prison because we found out he was working for Joseph Stalin as a spy, as a paid agent. And so you have totalitarians who created the UN, even people who we never proved were actually agents of a mass murdering hostile foreign dictatorship admitted what was going on. People like John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State during this time, wrote a book called War or Peace. And if you read this book, he tells you right in there that this UN was supposed to serve as the nucleus of a future world government. He said the world government could operate perfectly under the existing UN charter that they had secured. It would be able to use military force to enforce compliance and all the other things. So the UN was started out at the beginning as a tool to try to undermine the sovereignty of the nation states of the world and the people groups of the world, to try to bring us all together into this global system. And now we're seeing the end game coming into view, where you have the World Health Organization working with Bill Gates, working with totalitarian governments, planning a global mass forced vaccination campaign, planning to have the World Health Organization become like the new global Ministry of Health, and all these different agencies, right? So it's a very nefarious.
So this is always how I try to talk to people that may still be struggling with this. As I say, okay, because when we did the show and we were talking about climate change and we talked about that, they're like, well, what, you don't want to help the earth? I mean, I have this beautiful nature pic in the background. Why would you want to destroy the planet? And it's like, well, their solution to any planetary problem with pollution or whatever is not the favorite solution that I've found. That's not the solution I want to go with. I want a solution to the problems we see, but that's not the one I want. I don't want Aldous Huxley's Brave New World combined with Orwell's 1984 to be the solution to this problem. And then the same thing with this virus, as you mentioned, the same computer models, they were wrong again. And that's the other thing, is I'm like, do you feel good trusting known liars and criminals for your information? And so then I did a show and there was a great article where they summarized 12 of the top experts in the world. So these are European experts. They're top of their field. Some of them work at Stanford and all these places. And they were all the rebels now. They've all been like blacklisted because they started speaking out against what the World Health Organization was saying. And they weren't just speaking against it, Alex. They were like, we have to stop this madness. This is going to cause so many more problems. If you people want to save the elderly and the immunocompromised, this is not the way to go. This is going to make things worse. It's going to plummet the economy. It's going to, this is the problem we're having, is this, there's a disconnect with people that are watching the news and people such as ourselves who are looking at what the actual experts are saying. Have you noticed this?
Absolutely, I have, and you brought up another very interesting parallel between the so-called environmental fight to save the environment and this
Mm.
coronavirus pandemic. In both cases, the ostensible solutions that are being peddled will do the exact opposite of what they claim. So, take the environment question for example. The UN is telling us that if we adopt an economic system along the lines of what the Soviet Union had, along the lines of what China has, along the lines of what North Korea has, where basically the government is in charge of everything. And I mean, all you have to do is read their own documents, and they'll tell you the Agenda 2030, right? Talking about global wealth redistribution, government control over everything, universal health care so that the government will run your healthcare system. The government should run everything. And, we know that this doesn't work. If you look at the environments of the different nations of the world, what you see is that the freest nations are also the cleanest from an environmental perspective. And this is true
Mm.
over and over and over again, right? What are some of the cleanest environments in the entire world? New Zealand, Australia, the United States of America, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, right? These are the countries that have pristine environments. These are the countries where the rivers are clean, where the lakes are clean, where the oceans are clean, where the forest is clean. I mean, these are the nations that really should be the model from an environmental perspective. And they all have something in common. Very, very free markets relative to the rest of the world. And I know some of those countries have, government healthcare systems and big government. But when you compare it to the more totalitarian models of China, of the Soviet Union, of North Korea, of Vietnam, of Uzbekistan, where the environment is basically a giant toxic wasteland, you see that, and even if you use the Index of Economic Freedom from the Heritage Foundation, you see that the countries with the most economic freedom, the freest markets, the most individual freedom are the countries that I just mentioned that have the best environments. The countries with the least amount of economic freedom, Zimbabwe, North Korea, Venezuela. These are the countries where the environment is a giant, stinking, rotting piece of garbage. And that's what happens, right?
Mm.
Economic freedom produces prosperity. Prosperous people can afford to care about the environment. They can afford to not want to dump pollution into the river. They can afford to clean up messes when messes happen. Poor people in centrally planned economies can't afford that. They're struggling to survive. They don't care if somebody's going to dump something in the river or somebody's going to chop down a forest or whatever. So it's very clear that following the UN's prescriptions on the environment would lead to an environmental cataclysm. The same is true, as you just pointed out, David, on the coronavirus thing. They're telling us that we need to all stay home, that we need to shut down the economy, and that this is going to keep us healthy. That is so ludicrous. And if you have, two brain cells to rub together, two brain cells on active duty, as I just heard said recently, you realize that this is going to be a catastrophe for public health, right? People are locked in their house. They're not getting vitamin D from the sunshine. They're not interacting with people to benefit their mental health. They're feeling isolated. They're feeling lonely. We found out from Cuomo now that the people getting coronavirus are the ones locked in their house. It's leading to skyrocketing suicide and depression rates because people are losing their jobs and their businesses are going under. I mean, anybody who believes these people, I'm sorry, at this point, you just got to wonder, what's wrong with you? I mean, don't you have any critical thinking skills at all? Can't you see with your eyes what's happening? We have been deceived. And it's almost always, what they tell us is almost always the opposite. If they tell us we need to shut down our economy for our health or to save the environment, you can be sure that's the worst possible thing we could do. Donna and Robert De Niro signing a big open letter about we need radical transformation of the world and we can never go back to how we were before, and blah, blah, blah. You have the governments of the world, even in the UK, the so-called conservative government saying the same thing. We're going to rebuild and it's going to be all green, right? And it's important to remember when they talk about green, there's a reason why we call them watermelons, right? Because they're green on the outside. They pretend to care about the environment, but really they're red on the inside. They just want totalitarian control over our lives and over the economy. So all of these different forces, the fake media, the fake celebrities, the fake scientists, the fake, UN world leaders, all of them are pushing in the same direction. We even have governors right close to you guys in Canada, Governor Inslee up in Washington State, saying the same thing. Oh, we're going to fight coronavirus and climate change at the same time using the same tools.
People from within these organizations like the WHO, the UN, the different organizations, have they come out? Have there been whistleblowers that have come out over the years to try to tell people, hey, this really isn't the right scientific model, or this really isn't a glowing, benevolent organization? Has there been whistleblowers over the years?
Oh my goodness, there's been so many of them, David, and I'm so glad you asked. So what
Mm,
happens is every time one of them turns and starts exposing the truth is they try to destroy them, they try to discredit them, and if that doesn't work, they actually kill them. Within the UN, I actually have a huge network of sources within the UN, and it drives the UN's leadership totally crazy. But
nice,
it is
nice.
what it is.
Keep doing that.
But if you go all the way back to the beginning of the UN, there was a guy, and we wrote about this in the New American. I really encourage people to go read this article. His name was Pavel Bang-Jensen. He was a Danish diplomat. He had been part of the anti-Nazi resistance to the Nazi Germans in Denmark. And, the UN leadership, many of them were actual Nazis, right? Kurt Waldheim, who ended up the Secretary General of the UN, was an actual Nazi, right? Okay, an
Wow.
actual stormtrooper with the SS for the Nazis. So he started blowing the whistle. He said, "Oh my goodness, guys, this UN thing is totally controlled by Soviet agents. It's controlled by communists." And he was working in these hearings where they were investigating what the Soviet Union had done in Hungary. And they had given the guarantee that when the witnesses came forward, their identities would be kept anonymous because they knew that the communist terror regime would take their families and torture them and slaughter them if they knew who it was that was speaking out. And so the UN promised these people anonymity. You can come and testify. You can come give the UN evidence so we can investigate what's going on there, and we will keep quiet about your real identity. Only we will know it. Well, what they found out was that high-ranking Soviet agents within the UN were passing the names of these people over to the Soviet government. And so their families were being disappeared, tortured, killed, etc. And Pavel Bang-Jensen started blowing the whistle, and he started saying, "Hey, this UN is totally controlled by Soviets. They're killing people. This is terrible." And he committed suicide after relentless persecution by the UN. They tried to call him crazy, and then finally they just suicided him in what was so obviously a staged suicide. And unfortunately, the track record hasn't gotten any better until today. I know whistleblowers. Some of this is out in public. Take Anders Compass as one example.
Mm,
Swedish human rights worker in the UN human rights bureaucracy. And he became very alarmed because UN peace troops were running around Africa raping children. And so he was getting the reports, these UN peace troops with the goofy blue helmets were raping children, kidnapping children,
Jesus.
selling them into sex slavery. I mean, this was a systematic thing going on with high-ranking officers involved. It wasn't just, some rogue lunatics. And so he said, "Hey, you guys, we got to do something about this." And I said, "Oh, just shush, be quiet." So he said, "Okay, well, I got to do something." So he became a whistleblower, not by choice. He just knew something had to be done because children were being raped by UN soldiers. So he passed that information on to French prosecutors, hoping they could do something. And you would think, hey, let's give this guy a medal, right? Protecting children from being raped by UN peace troops. Now, that is a heroic action, or at least something that a common, decent person would do.
Right.
Well, instead, they fired him. They smeared him in the media. They marched him out of his office under armed guard, and they had a secret meeting in Turin in Italy. All the leadership of the UN came together. We ended up getting the leaked documents, and they plotted on how can we destroy this guy? How can we ruin his credibility? So that was a big wake-up call to a lot of people. There's another one I interviewed not too long ago. Her name is Emma Riley, also working for the UN human rights machine. She found out that Chinese dissidents who were testifying at the UN, who were trying to get help from the UN because the mass murdering communist Chinese dictatorship was using its terror apparatus to destroy, torture, kill, etc. She found out somebody in the UN at a high level was passing the names of these dissidents back to China so that their families could be tortured, so that they could be prevented from leaving China to provide evidence to the UN. So what happened to her? She got a medal. No, of course not, right? They smeared her, destroyed her career, got rid of her. Now she's going through the appeals process, but this is what happens to whistleblowers. And so that's why so few people are willing to go public with these things, because they know their job will be destroyed, their career will be destroyed, their reputation will be destroyed. But there are so many of these. We've covered it very, very extensively. And, the same thing is true in the scientific community. The UN, I'll give you another example. Niels Axel Morner, he's one of the world's top geophysicists, if not the world's leading expert on sea levels. He was the lead reviewer on the UN IPCC's sea level section for their global warming reports. And he said, guys, this is all wrong. The seas are not rising. I've been monitoring this for 50 years. He was the head of the geophysics and geodynamics department at Stockholm University, and they loved him before he started blowing the whistle on this. He said, this is all wrong, guys. You can't put out this report. It's just wrong. We're not going to drown. In fact, if anything, the ocean is going down in most places, and we're not going to do this. Well, they said, oh, now he's a quack. You can't believe him. He's a conspiracy theorist. He's a kook. The same people who put him on to be a lead reviewer. And so I did a 30-minute interview with him in Stockholm. You can see that on YouTube.
Really?
It's been seen more than 100,000 times. But there's so many examples like this, David. I could go on forever.
Wow, wow. So guys, can you hear that? Can and don't just listen to what Alex said. Go research it. Go look into it. We're not just talking out of our ass here. And when I'm saying you're trusting known liars and criminals right now, we're not just talking about a couple petty slaps on the wrist with a little bit of fraud and a little bit of taking a little thing. No, no, this weaves into the global trafficking networks as well. Well, let's do closing comments on this, Alex. We kind of have to do the sales pitch for freedom today because every time I say freedom, people are like, So, I know this sounds obvious, but we got to ask it. Why is freedom such an important thing to defend?
Well, for one, because it allows us to control our own lives and our own decisions. And, if you're not free to do what you want to do, obviously respecting the rights of others, then you're a slave, and a slave is no way to live, right? Freedom, I think, is one of the most important values. It's also, I think, God, and I know you're not a religious person, David, but I think it's God's design for mankind. God said we have a right to life. God said we have a right to property. God said we have a right to liberty, and I think all those things are fundamental. We need to protect them. There's some things that are worth more than life itself, and I would say liberty is one of those. I would rather live. The state motto of the state of New Hampshire, which is not far from you guys up in Canada, is "Live free or die." And the reason the people of New Hampshire decided on that as their state motto, and that was a very common saying during the War for Independence era, is because liberty is more valuable than life itself. Is life worth living if you're going to be a slave? If you're going to spend all day, every day doing what somebody else tells you to do for their benefit? And I would say no, it's not. So we must protect freedom. And even the people who don't appreciate freedom for freedom's sake, I feel sorry for you. But I can guarantee you appreciate the fruits of freedom, right?
Mm.
Prosperity, right? The fact that we have every kind of good and service we can imagine. We have all the food that we need. We all have homes. We have heating and electricity and light bulbs. The reason for that is because of our freedom. The reason we have peace and security is because of our freedom. As we lose freedom, we see tyranny, mass death, starvation, shortages, right? Just look around the world, folks. Look at history. It's so clear. Freedom is better than tyranny on every possible front. Don't be a fool. Don't give it up. Your forefathers put their lives on the line so that you could be free today. Don't give it up.